I'm an Australian artist. I've been living in Paris for nearly 40 years. My name's Rebecca Driffield. I originally came here on a residency to paint for a few months and then fell in love and fell in love with Paris and with a French person. And so I then had a whole redecision to make about where I wanted to continue working. And I found Paris incredibly stimulating creatively, just in terms of the amount of information, just walking in a street, going on the metro, the multicultural aspect of it. I just found it completely wonderful. And it was, in my mind, no question about returning back to Australia. That being said, I love my country of origin, but I have the dilemma of coming from the other side of the planet. And so it was a very big decision. And I actually was very lucky because I came originally on a grant from the equivalent of the Ministry of Culture. It's called Mr. in Castle. And so I applied for another one in order to stay on in France for at least a year with finance. And I was selected for a very good grant. So that enabled me to find my feet, if you like. And I then was lucky because it was a time where I think now there are a lot of artists, and it's become a very large and competitive field. That's not necessarily negative, but it creates some of the problem getting visibility. And when I came, it was easier. There were salons like the Salon d'Automne, Salon de la Jeune Peinture. There were things like that, and that was really wonderful because I got a lot of attention, and I had the honor of having a solo show in the cadre of the Grand Ballet, which was great. This little solo show in the Salon de la Jeune Peinture. So the beginning years were very constructive and sort of step building into sort of finding my place here. What my work is about is the human face, the interaction between people. So obviously living in a big city that's thriving and full of sort of different cultures, different stories, there's just endless stimulation. And my whole exploration is the human face in terms of what we see, what we read into looking at a human face. And I find that really interesting because I think more and more culture is about something that's visual. And so subliminally, we are always reading things that we don't really articulate, that we understand. And that can be used in a manipulative way, can be used, it's very much used in marketing and advertising in order to be seductive, attractive, etc., as we all know. But what my interest is the sort of private world that we see if we really look at a face, and that what we understand in it. And actually his recent portraits that I did, that are in exhibition at the moment, they're inspired by some portraits that were done by this 19th century English photographer, Julia Margaret Cameron, and in the 19th century. And she often used her maids or just children, or no one particularly in the celebrity field. She also did some very reputable people, scientists, etc., Charles Darwin, people of that era. But the portraits that really interested me were of these young girls who come from very poor backgrounds, and they were working for her, and she would put them in these historical contexts, and their faces were full of courage but very vulnerable. And I felt that's what I wanted to try and express, in particularly in the regard, in the eyes. How I start with every painting, be it a portrait, commissioned portrait, or a narrative painting, is always with one face and the eyes. And when that becomes alive and authentic for me, and I draw it in charcoal, that sort of then radiates out a whole narrative. So, and every time is new, and every time is a bit like going on stage for the first time. I don't have a formula that I can fall back on, but personally I think that's the exciting aspect of creativity. Well, I think for any artist, any artistic endeavor, I think there's the inspiration, there's the desire, but there's also the technical basis that has to be there. And so I think the advantage of being an older artist is that you've been doing it for many years. So you have more confidence in your technique. So I think I can say that there's always, you want to achieve something, you have this desire that you want to achieve this. So the challenge is, can you achieve it? And that comes from many different strands. So there's the technical side of it. So you have to know your material. You have to understand how that works. And that comes through being trained and experience. And also there are moments when it just all comes together. And there are moments it doesn't. But I find, for me, there's a moment I sort of lose myself in it. I don't know. It is an extraordinary process creating, I think. And it's it's one of the best things in life, because you sort of go up on a wave, and when it works, you're traveling on that wave. So
You came from Australia, the other part of our planet, to Paris, It's a long distance. What was the consequence? What was the result of this relocation?
after I finished my art degree in Australia, I actually had the experience of leaving Australia and going to London. So I lived in London for a couple of years. So I'd had that experience of sort of pulling myself out of my own cultural safe place to go into something that was still Anglo-Saxon. It was still my own language. It wasn't a bouleversement. It wasn't a complete sort of upset of all my experience. It wasn't muting in that way. I have a great affiliation with London. I love London, and I am extremely honoured and grateful to the National Portrait Gallery, because I have a portrait in the permanent collection, which is a great honour. And they've also recognised my work on various moments with the annual Portrait Award. So that's very special to me. And I think that it's interesting, because I think the Parisian and London culture and landscape are very complementary. What you find in London, you don't find in Paris, and vice versa. So I find that very enriching as well, just culturally, and the way things are done and the approaches. And I sort of feel I'm a mix of the two things, if you like. No. Coming from the other side of the planet, I think being an expatriate is a complex state, psychologically and emotionally. But I think it's the best thing, because I think you learn a lot about yourself. You're also learning a lot of new things, which is always really important in life, I think. And so it was, in the beginning, it was very tough because I didn't speak French. My French was abysmal. But I married someone who resisted learning English, so I had no choice. And at the time that was difficult, but I'm very grateful, because it actually was being thrown into the deep end. And I think that's a good way to learn a language, actually, when you have to learn it. So.
Today, as we are talking, you're a famous and well-experienced artist. What's your advice to your younger self?
To my younger self, or to younger artists?
Les deux. Yeah.
Well, I think I probably have that artist spirit of being very determined. So I think most artists have that somewhere, but also terrific doubt, terrific in the awful doubt. I think there's a sort of up and down that all our good artists should have that. I don't think you should be too self-satisfied. I think you should be always questioning, but not to the point that you're paralyzed and don't produce anything. To my younger self, or to younger artists, I think you need to learn to ride the waves. Sometimes everything comes together. There's a lot of luck involved. Meeting the right person. I mean, recently, this great experience of meeting Tanas Kashavarzian, that's a wonderful thing for me, to sort of have another opportunity to show my work, and someone who approaches the art scene intelligently. That's really important. But sometimes the doors are closed, and you just have to weather that. And over, above, and everything else is just to keep working, keep producing your work, keep doing it. If you really believe in it, it's really something that is important to you, keep doing it.
There's a cinematic aspect here of artworks. We are not just looking to the painting, it looks like a film of a movie. Why it is like that? And I also want to know about the psychological aspect of these faces, these paintings.
So yes, so that's astute because I find cinema incredibly inspiring. The art scenes go through different trends. So there was a trend when work was very conceptual, more intellectual, but so I didn't find that particularly chimed with my interests. But I've always found cinema, always, just completely enthralling. And it's the idea of a narrative, but it's also how you can have a sort of juxtaposition of different images, which then create an emotion. So the Russian cinematographer Eisenstein talks about that in the book that he wrote. That very interesting. You can have one image, and then next to it you put another image, and it will tell a story, and then you put another image, and it will tell another story. And I find that really fascinating. Just that sort of power of two images put together. So that's why quite a lot of my work has several sort of parts to it, which then can be related to in a particular way. And it's not as though I'm saying you have to read it in that way. It's, for me, it tells a story, but it is also open for you to make a story of it as you see it. So, and I think often the cinema, it's a bit ambiguous. You're not quite sure. You follow it through. You project your own emotions onto it, your own experience, and I really like that. So, and the psychological thing, no, I find that deeply interesting. When we all carry a whole sort of story within our minds psychologically and emotionally. So, and each one is different. So if I create a face, it's not based on anyone, but it may be a starting point from a face that I find the face very interesting. That I like that exploration to try and express that in the actual image.
It is you're trying to actually paint what your unconsciousness that tells you to do.
Probably. I mean, a lot of it is intuitive because I can start at the point, but then I think when you're making a work of art, it's a bit like a writer as well, that you might have a plan, but then the work takes over, it takes you to somewhere else. And that's very interesting as well. I mean, it's not like joining things up by colors or dots. If it's like, for me personally, if it's like that, it's not a journey that's particularly interesting. Yeah, I'm very interested in trying to express a feeling. It's about being very expressive, my work.
You let the brush right on the canvas. Cool.
Well, I always start with drawing. So the drawing is a sort of basis of all my work. So I work on linen, Belgian linen, which is primed in animal skin glue. It's a very ancient way of preparing for oil painting. And then I just draw on it with charcoal. And I love drawing. I think drawing is a really noble thing because, yeah, when you learn to draw, you actually learn to see. So all this in our minds, that goes, you actually see things very clearly. So I think that process of drawing, I can draw because I went to a school where we had a lot of rigorous life drawing with model. And so if I want to draw something, I have that basis, and then I build around that with the painting. But I hope that the drawing somewhere is always present. So, and the charcoal mixes in quite a lot with the paint. So there's a slightly smoky quality to the painting. So
How important is the sensation, the perception of audience by audience on your artworks?
well, I think it's always incredibly rewarding and heartwarming when someone gets what you're doing. But I think if you try to please too much, then you lose what you really are capable of doing. I think it's a very fine balance because to say that you don't want a warm response to your work, I think it is almost dishonest. I mean, yeah, I think that's important, but it shouldn't be the most important thing by any means. So, and I think for younger artists, that's complicated because there are a lot of trends, I think, much more than perhaps before. There's much more pressure to be liked and seen and before the next thing comes along. So I think that I don't feel that pressure so much, to be honest.
What about the market? Because its own pressures on the galleries and artists. How do you deal with that?
So, well, I think that's a really interesting question and a very apt question because I think that's radically changed. Um, I can't remember the exact date. I think it sort of around about 2008. There's this huge shift, or maybe a bit before, but the art market apparently was one of the what's the expression? Not protected. A lot of money could be sunk into it, and that completely altered how people were looking at art. They were looking at it often as an investment. It was also that work became a product. Uh, some work became marketed. And so I think for gallerists and for artists, that became a completely different dynamic. And how do I feel about it personally? I think it is what it is now. So I think um, ideally, I would, if someone buys my work, I want them to really respond to it. But some people might buy it for investment because now I have a certain level. So I don't know. I mean, it is what it is.
Let's talk about your ongoing projects.
Okay, so I have currently had this exhibition at the Gallery Kashavarzian in Paris, which is great. So that's the spring, and I also have a couple of commissioned portraits that I'm working on outside of the gallery that have come to me through clients from because I have this reputation also as being an artist with the National Portrait Gallery in London. That's enabled me to do commissioned portraits. Then we have the SAR, and then after that, I am actually really interested in finding a gallery in London because I would like to have more visibility there. But I have a gallery in Paris, so there'll be undoubtedly projects that come up over the next 12 months. Thank you.
Thank you.